Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Robin, for that lovely introduction and for the kind invitation to say a few words here this afternoon about the provocative, suggestive, and explorative work of Deanna Bowen, John Akomfrah, and Stuart Hall. I'm delighted to be here and contribute to an ongoing conversation about a trifecta of artists and theorists who invite us to play more carefully with history, memory, and cultural politics. That is to say, Bowen, Akomfrah, and Hall encourage us to think more deeply about politically infused acts of pleasure. They provide us with models of how to archive diasporic and dissident art with care, sensitivity, and humility. Furthermore, they are cartographers who map the freedom dreams of subjects who are often in, but not always of, the global north. In the sum of the parts, what can be named, Deanna Bowen speaks to plural audience that is fractured along experiential fault lines. She performs an oral history that uses numbers in a manner that is comforting to timid academics who acquiesce to the dominance of quantitative methods that reign in the social sciences. Sum of the parts is aware that statistics and metrics are accorded value by the presentism of politicians and NGOs looking for evidence-based solutions to the pressing issues of our day, and the qualitative methods may not count for very much with such audiences. Yet Bowen's oral history is also sensitive to the ways in which numbers are remarkably powerless in other domains of life, and often need to be hooked up to narratives and historical timelines for us to recognize the lives of others, even if this is just a means to tug on our heartstrings, elicit sympathy, and sentimental concern with the suffering of others that may produce some more charitable and political donations. The sum of the parts is thus orchestrated to also speak to a Canadian audience that accords prestige to the opinion sections of the New York Times and is familiar with the sterile white walls of contemporary art galleries, as well as the advertisements in Art Forum that frame what we apprehend and recognize as human life. As Elie Wiesel reminded us in an article in the New York Times in 1989 that influenced Bowen's project, we must see that our memories are more than isolated events, more than the sum of those events, if we are to take seriously the task of how we transmit memories and wounded sensibilities. While Bowen's oral history is mindful of official politics and history and opinion leaders in the media and art world, she ensures that her invocation of the likes of Pierre Trudeau, Wilfrid Laurier, and Abraham Lincoln goes far beyond the pop history lessons of Billy Joel, Steven Spielberg, or Malcolm Gladwell, designed for distracted consumers. Bowen's work also asks us to take seriously the question of where we may identify the sources of power and authority, by also alluding to the sacred spaces of nightclubs and churches. We are left to ponder where we look for political legitimacy in the spaces we call Canada and the United States. Shall we look at the pulpit? Shall we look at the protest march, the polling booth, the art gallery, the nightclub dance floor, or the festival stage? Most pointedly, Bowen shares a critical lens through which we may apprehend our metaphysical notions of time, space, and violence, as well as ongoing dispossession of land. There is an awareness in the sum of the parts that relying on the state for protection from violence, particularly the extra-legal violence and white terrorism of lynching, is precisely to exchange one form of violence for another, to be exposed to the violence of the nation state. There is an invitation for us to think more deeply about the creation of imagined pasts and futures in which the nation is always considered righteous and its destruction unthinkable. There is an awareness of the violent abstractions of a state that assumes its innocence and good governance when it proposes the better management of education, the better management of healthcare, the better management of migration. What's also interesting for me is how Bowen complicates and exemplifies how the presentation of a public persona is a founding motif in the tradition of the African diaspora that works across, within, and against nation states. In doing so, Bowen speaks back to a Black radical tradition that emphasizes the critical role of self-creation and self-emancipation in producing subjects of freedom. In the well-known narrative of Frederick Douglass, for example, authority and autonomy emerge directly from the personal tone of the history. And in W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, we find the sociological writing infused by personal and political history, as well as fiction, autobiography, ethnography, and poetry. It bears repetition that such practices were essential for modern subjects, forced to confront forms of anti-Black racism that doubted their ability to eloquently communicate their words and complex ideas without the spooky presence of white ghostwriters. Are such questions and concerns past? Do they resonate in the story not told by Bowen about the world of Canada and the United States between 1996 and 2010? In the rest of my intervention this afternoon, I'd like to pick up where Bowen left off and speak about some revealing texts that help us to think through Canadian identity that were published after 1996. I'd also like to connect these texts to a broader territory of struggle that may be considered part of a transatlantic exchange between British cultural studies and North America, or more pointedly, translocal exchange between theorists and artists in Birmingham, in London, Montreal, and New York over the past 50-odd years. In the words of the Montreal-born scholar Richard Eiton in his magisterial In Search of the Black Fantastic, such translocal exchange is critical if we are to recognize, contest, and profane the attempts of national politicians to speak of the arc of history bending towards justice. Put slightly differently, a focus on translocalism may help us to unsettle the type of narrative favored by Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau, in which slavery gives way to emancipation, colonialism to post-colonial independence, racism to colorblindness, forced to voluntary labor and movement. There is, of course, real purpose to counter narratives that know that the drivers of real history are not always to be found in Washington or Ottawa, or the newspapers that are read by political elites. So, let's begin by turning to Ottawa in 1997, where the government of the Liberal Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, created the necessary political space to publish a newcomer's introduction to Canada. This document sought to guide recent arrivals along a yellow brick road towards happy lives as responsible, informed, and successful Canadian citizens. And, as a result, also invited curious readers to go behind the curtain and wince at its wizardly omissions and proclamations. There were, for example, no moments in which the document displayed any self-deprecating irony about stereotypes that cast Canadian bureaucrats as dull and risk-averse. Nor were there any sections of the text that reflected an engagement with activist intellectuals who contested rigid gender roles and encouraged critical reflection about performativity, heteronormativity, and governmentality. As a result, The document portrayed the Canadian way of life as one in which Canadian men may formally embrace old friends or family with a handshake, but almost never kiss other men in public. And passionate kissing or touching are considered impolite and offensive in public. Aside from suggesting formal codes of behavior to instruct and discipline public displays of affection, a newcomer's introduction to Canada also felt compelled to express its concerns about recent arrivals transporting any beliefs around police corruption to the New World. It explicitly reminded immigrants about the importance of public displays of deference when interacting with Canadian police officers and other authority figures. And its section on acceptance, tolerance, and respect is worth quoting at length for audiences who do not wish to evacuate their responsibility to wrestle with challenging and unsettling theory about bad faith and racism. According to a newcomer's introduction to Canada, some people may tell you that there is no racism in Canada. Others may say that racism is a very serious problem. The truth lies somewhere in between. Some Canadians may make you feel unwelcome. However, the majority of Canadians are fair-minded. They will accept and respect anyone who accepts and respects them. These 6 short sentences not only provide evidence of civil servants reflecting and informing the common sense belief that Canadians are fair-minded people who value tolerance and acceptance. They not only imply that racism in Canada is a result of a few bad apples that may perhaps be solved by more public works and government services devoted to intercultural communication and diverse representations of healthy, happy Canadian citizens showing off their perfect white teeth. They also consider it a self-evident truth that racism is not a very serious problem in the Great White North and should not, therefore, be viewed as a central element of national policy and debate. So, the writers of A Newcomer's Guide to Canada seem somewhat beholden to a rigid and rather frigid approach to a prim and proper vision of the English stiff upper lip, cricket, and maybe a nice cup of tea. They do not seriously engage with Stuart Hall, who had done so much as a public intellectual, to convey the point that the actions of imperial power over there, in Vietnam, in Syria, in Jamaica, is part of the sugar we stir in the US, in Canada, in the UK. As we all witness in the Stuart Hall Project, Hall reminds us about a changing same of resistance and racism, and the ability of creative artists and theorists to do what politicians only pretend to do, i.e., to speak with dreadful objectivity to the deep, unarticulated emotions of a translocal and multiracial community. Writers of public policy in Canada are far from unusual in ignoring Hall's keen insights about British identity that could but not be reduced to the fantasies and fears of Little Englanders. In the UK in the 1980s, advertisers were also uninterested in Hall's dreadful objectivity about post-colonial melancholia. And I'd like to share with you an advert for the Austin Metro that helps exemplify some of this point.
Some of you may have noticed that for the past few years, Britain has been invaded by the Italians, the Germans, the Japanese, and the French. Now we have the means to fight back. The new Austin Metro. The new Metro is so aerodynamic that at a steady 50 miles per hour, the Metro HLE gets 62 miles per gallon. The new Metro has a split-action rear seat to let you choose between more space or more seats. And to help send the invaders back where they came from, The new Austin Metro goes 12,000 miles or 1 full year between services. The new Austin Metro. A British car to beat the world.
As John Oliver might say, doesn't it make you proud to be British? After watching the Stuart Hall Project, we may also imagine that the pictures of the White Cliffs of Dover and the none too subtle allusions to Anglo-Saxon culture, Churchill and the beaches of Normandy may have always already been present when Stuart went with his family down to the beaches of southern England or prepared to take part in discussions at the BBC. Do we not see in Stuart's eyes the awareness of little Englanders who talk about the threats of loony lefties, defecating on English traditions, or non-white culture polluting the scepter isle? Do we not see someone always a little different, always a little dissatisfied, still grappling with the types of difficult European theory that is invariably described or dismissed as obtuse and out of touch with English empiricism, still gravitating towards the resistive, elliptical work of Miles Davis? As many fans of Miles Davis know, there's a popular joke that suggests country and Western artists find it hard to imagine a world with irony, while jazz musicians can't imagine a world without it. In Akomfrah's Stuart Hall Project, we have hints that Hall's work, like any great jazz-infused work, seems loose and unstructured, but has a strong backbone and discernible motifs to careful listeners alive to productive tensions. To go further, we see that Hall's renown is not perhaps known so much through his academic journal articles, but how he spoke to conferences, delivered public lectures, as an ironic intellectual whose mission was not to challenge the desire not to take black politics seriously, but to avoid the pitfalls of taking black cultural politics too seriously or too literally. So many of the texts regularly cited in the Hall canon are papers that he read at conferences with a keen sense of his audience and the need to develop powerful images and phrases about the circulation of race in British life, the desires of authoritarian populists, like the Conservative Party in 1983, that sought to denounce radical political blackness and create a world in which blackness disappears and subjects are hailed as British, and renounce any extra national identification that is not marketable. The bad faith of these adverts is that they were strategically positioned in quote-unquote ethnic minority newspapers or in public transportation centres close to large areas of ethnic minority individuals in London. The diversity of Hall's life and work cannot be conveyed within a 90-minute documentary, or the free-screen installation with which Akomfrah also grappled with the memory of his friend, of his colleague, and his comrade. But we do have a sense of the narrative of Hall's life. His arrival in the UK in the 1950s, when the New Left understood that the paradigmatic instance of capitalist development was the United States and not Britain. We learn how Stuart disembarked from one particular path, the life of a literary critic, continuing to work on his dissertation on Henry James at Oxford, and pursued an alternate life that involved teaching in British secondary schools. When we turn to the 1960s, we will see Stuart campaigning for nuclear disarmament, traveling to California in the summer of 1967, and, of course, taking over from Richard Hoggart as director for the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham in 1968. where he remained until 1979, facilitating the work of politically committed students who wanted to pursue journeys of intellectual discovery. The Stuart Hall Project is thus invaluable in helping us to see the continuities between a charismatic young man speaking at CND rallies and the Caribbean artist movement, and becoming the director of an anti-disciplinary movement that asked us to take seriously intellectual work produced outside of academia, as well as structures of feeling, the lived, effective, unfixed, half-articulated way that most of us experience our lives most of the time, and that comes into awareness when we notice the contrast between generations who never quite talk the same language, or when we read an account of ourselves by someone outside the community who has learned our ways but not been bred in them. So I'd like to move towards my conclusion by spending a little bit of time noting Hall's ambivalence about America, or particularly the United States, and how his politics and poetics have been mistranslated by some of his North American interlocutors. So in the UK, cultural studies was often associated with a motley crew of communists, lecturers, students, black radicals, pornographers, Penguin Books, the BBC, The Guardian, and on occasion, the jazz reviewer for the Times. Conservative publications were worried about being swamped, in Margaret Thatcher's famous terms, the notion that white communities felt that they may be swarmed by non-white voices and beliefs. In the US, as you can see in Jameson's quote, as well as the eerily similar wording in Barack Obama's memoir, when he disparaged those old 60s radicals flogging newspapers on the fringes of college towns. Cultural studies was similarly associated with political others. I'm not entirely sure what the signifiers of dangerous, radical, fifth columnists in Canada would be, but perhaps we can discuss some of them after the screening and produce a bingo game that we can unveil whenever we listen to Kelly Leach, Jordan Peterson, or another flavor of the month, root around for un-Canadian values or cultural Marxists under the bed, the lectern or the course outlines. As Terry Eagleton reminds us, anyone writing a novel about the British intellectual left, who began by looking around for some exemplary figure to link its various trends and phrases, would find themselves spontaneously reinventing Stuart Hall. Since he arrived in Britain from Jamaica in 1951, Hall connected everything from the New Left to the New Times. Charming, charismatic, formidably bright, and probably the most electrifying public speaker. He was a preternaturally youthful character whose personal style evokes a range of faded American epithets. Hip, neat, cool, right on. In short, there's a sense we get here that cultural studies is sociology plus street cred. And yet Eagleton's comment also misses the point that the imposition of an American label on Hall profoundly misrecognizes a British subject who did not like to talk autobiographically and was disorientated by cultural studies in the US, that was divorced from political projects and seemed overly focused on celebrity culture or fan fiction. Hall was repeatedly invited to the US and spent a couple of terms in good universities there, but he found it impossible to understand the culture. He found it impossible to take his bearings. And this perhaps helps explain the profound misrecognition of Hall in North American media, in which a critic of official and corporate multiculturalism is hailed as the godfather of multiculturalism. In short, Stuart is fondly recalled as a scholar and an intellectual, as a political critic and an activist, as someone who valued the arts as a necessary political activity. And this familiarity and intimacy has been misappropriated in a manner that might evoke the one-name branding of an Oprah or a Spike or any other assorted African Americans who tend to treat Black identity as a means to defend their history as a familial project or a family affair, rather than advance a collective political project. So, the last kind of slides that I'd like to think through with you this afternoon is to articulate a little bit more around Stuart's legacy, how we can think about cultural studies in a future tense. And perhaps the best known intellectual to pick up Hall's challenge to theorize joyfully disorganic communities is Paul Gilroy. And here you can see a brief extract from Stuart's famous presentation to the Illinois Cultural Studies Conference in 1990, in which he expressed his reluctance to speak autobiographically, and only did so in order to absolve himself of the burden of speaking for the entire Black race, British politics, as well as for cultural studies. Hall did not want his experiences of the tensions and difficulties of the development of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham during the 1970s, the interruptions around gender, as well as the difficulty that Paul Gilroy and the group of people who produced The Empire Strikes Back faced in creating the necessary political and theoretical space in which to work on the project. Hall is always already aware of the danger of being read as someone who delivers authoritative declarations. He's always already aware of the danger of being hailed as an entrepreneurial intellectual. He's aware that there may have been a demand to consolidate Stuart Hall studies or a Black British middle class. And so he wanted to honor the practices of a CCCS that grappled with Gramsci and Marx, rather than turn them into Old Testament prophets, who at the correct moment might offer consoling and appropriate quotations. And if we fast forward a generation and pick up the story after the death of Stuart Hall in 2014, Paul Gilroy has indeed found a place as a distinguished professor. After Hall's passing, Gilroy has been hailed as the most influential intellectual writing in the UK, often invited to speak at the BBC, but also, as you can see here, in various art exhibitions. In the autumn of 2015, Gilroy created the necessary theoretical and political space to deliver a talk that challenged narrow scholars who were unwilling or unable to talk across geographies, technologies, and political possibilities in a cosmopolitan and dialogical manner. He also acknowledged that he spoke from a somewhat parochial position as a Londoner concerned around North American voices drowning out others in this translocal exchange. Ironically, his comments about the power of North American voices were interrupted by Ruth Phillips, Canada Research Chair in Modern Culture and Professor of Art History at my own institution, Carleton, who asked if he meant to limit his critique to the United States. In response, Gilroy doubled down and repeated that he meant to indict Canadian and American academics who rarely addressed their power in polite academic society. With a rhetorical flourish, he went on to pronounce that Canadians had been selling multicultural snake oil to the world for years. Gilroy's incisive comments encourage us to view a Canadian state with dreadful objectivity, to acknowledge its strategic attempts to distance itself from American power, promote images of happy, smiling, state-sanctioned or corporate multiculturalism, and cynically co-opt the demands of marginalized groups within the consultation, diversity, post-industrial complex. After all, Gilroy's comments were delivered maybe 2 weeks after Trudeau's well-known quip that gender parity in his cabinet was the right and obvious thing to do because it's 2015. And in doing so, they provided a pointed rejoinder to terse comments from the newly appointed Liberal Prime Minister that suggested a notion of historical progress leading towards justice. Gilroy's contributions look, instead, to the radical imaginations of anti-colonial intellectuals and troubadours who shaped the 1960s and continue to unsettle our notion of linear progress. Reminding readers about a changing same of racism and racial hierarchy in an age of digital reproduction, Gilroy claims Frantz Fanon and other philosophers of liberation as contemporaries for activist intellectuals hoping to provide some content and a cutting edge to the resistance to neoliberal multiculturalism in the 21st century. His contributions to intellectual exchange also acknowledge a sense of loss and regression and suggest that our digital age may also be understood as a site in which we may apprehend the regression of Black music, the decline of careful listening, and the shrinking of imaginations from diasporic and global perspectives. Rather than offer journalists oversimplified material to pontificate around globalized anywheres against localized somewheres, Gilroy's unabashed utopianism and planetary humanism encourage us to think more deeply about the framing of multicultural national citizens in the global north. That is to say, we are not only asked to consider how multicultural national citizens are considered more universal and legitimate than purportedly monocultural others. I'm thinking of figures who are apprehended, for example, as so-called Arab terrorists, so-called Muslim extremists, or indigenous radicals. We are also asked to consider how the multicultural national subject may also be considered more universal and legitimate than multicultural world citizens, exiles and dissidents who are recognized for programs, say, to support refugees or female education in the global south. If we listen carefully to Hall and Gilroy and carefully reflect on the ability of Bowen and Akomfrah to extend and complicate their work, we have the opportunity to foster a radical and diverse imagination that not only critiques capitalism and the unjust practices of the state, but also expresses a passionate belief in history and the historical process. We may even, perhaps, provide some content and cutting edge for those of us who consider it a very serious problem for multicultural, outer-national, and translocal subjects to follow a yellow brick road towards national citizenship, particularly when they are asked to accept the horrible gift of freedom in which they are always already cast as thankful and appreciative characters to be welcomed and protected by kind, peaceful, and tolerant settler colonial subjects. Thank you very much.